Well, welcome back, everyone. We had a nice little lunch break, and I just wanted to say we are still live from the museum, and I have the great pleasure of introducing Dr. Jessica Hernandez. She's our next presenter, and she's going to talk about the indigenous futures in the era of climate change. She has her wonderful book, Fresh Banana Leaves, and we have some copies here in the museum, and she has been so gracious enough to sign some too. So come get them while we have them. And with that, I will turn it over to you, and we're super excited to have you here.
Yeah, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, awesome. So, Bondeo Padichi Biguri, I'm Dr. Jessica Hernandez, and I am Maya Chorti and Zapotec, so I come from south of the border, also known as Latin America. So today's presentation is Indigenous Futures in the Era of Climate Change. And a little bit more about me. So as I mentioned, I'm Maya Chorti and Zapotec. My family has been displaced to what is now known as the United States. My education, I went to UC Berkeley, where I majored in oceanography, marine sciences. So I study our ocean, the physical and natural processes that happen in our oceans. Then I went to the University of Washington, where I completed my doctoral degree in forestry and climate science. And I was raised in the beautiful lands of the Tonga people, also known as Los Angeles, California. So I think that given today's presentation and how we're going to talk about climate change, I wanted to bring more awareness and also highlight what's happening in Puerto Rico, especially with Hurricane Fiona. I also want to mention what's happening in Alaska with the typhoons and how is that impacting the Alaskan natives and the communities there today. So I wanted to take this moment to acknowledge that, given that today's presentation is on climate change, and these are the impacts that we're seeing, especially as it impacts our indigenous communities. So climate change. So what is climate change? And I apologize, but for some reason they're a little bit blurry, my things. So as we know, climate change, there is the greenhouse effect, and the greenhouse effect is actually a natural phenomenon, a process that our Earth undergoes. We see how there's solar radiation, so basically the energy that's coming from the sun, and how that's either transported out, reflected back by our Earth's atmospheres, or it's also observed. So one of the things that we're noticing is that with the greenhouse effect, given our high dependence on our energy sources, especially our extractive energy sources, we're seeing how there is more impacts, right? So we know that the greenhouse effect is a natural phenomenon, and it's often used to rebuttal the existence of climate change. So a lot of climate change deniers mention this, right? That the greenhouse effect is actually a natural phenomenon. And I think that's important to mention that without the greenhouse effect happening, our Earth will actually be frozen, right? So it will be in the negative 18 degrees Celsius. So it's something that keeps us alive today. And we also have greenhouse gases, especially from natural biogeochemical processes that happen, like the water cycle. So when we get rain, that's actually emitting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. However, as I mentioned, right, our huge dependence on extractive energy sources are actually increasing the greenhouse gases that are being emitted into our atmosphere. So as we see that, we see how instead of the radiation being reflected back into our Earth, it's actually maintained within the Earth's atmospheres. So that's why we have this increase in global warming, right? So I think that it's important to mention that, especially given that there is so much false information, especially as it pertains to climate change and what is actually happening in our Earth's atmosphere. Okay. Let's see. Come on. So today's presentation, right, is talking about indigenous futures in the era of climate change. And I think that it's important to highlight the inequities that exist, especially as climate change pertains to indigenous peoples. So we know that the first inequity is the degree of responsibility for climate change. So in the cases of Alaska and Puerto Rico, we know that it's indigenous peoples paying the ultimate price for climate change impacts because, they're being severely impacted by those effects. We also see that the impact of climate change, especially in the global south, where my communities are located, is severe and it's actually impacting us more, right? Even though a lot of the global north is responsible for emitting those extreme greenhouse concentrations into our atmosphere. We also know that inequity 3, right, is the ability and capacity to deal with the impacts of climate change. So we're seeing how even in our relatives in Alaska, they're not really necessarily receiving the necessary support to deal with the typhoon that they're actually undergoing as we speak today. And we also know that there is intergenerational trauma and impacts as a result of climate change. And that can be related to displacement. And we're going to see that off as we undergo more climate change impacts in the next years. So I wanted to, contextualize indigenous futures and climate change to the lands where I come from, and that is Central America. So I am Maya Chorti, and one of the misconceptions is that the Mayan people are extinct, right? We have all heard that, especially in books, in movies, how it portrays us as something from the, people from the past, but we are still present, right? And we have over 54 Maya nations and pueblos throughout Central America and south of Mexico as well. And I think that, given the displacement that I was talking about and how that's related to climate change, it's important to also mention the war that happened in Central America, especially this war that has been coined as a genocide by the United Nations because it impacted and targeted indigenous Maya people. So in 1980s to the 1990s, we saw that happen in El Salvador, where my father is from. And then we saw that happening, the armed conflict, as it's referred to in Guatemala, happened between the 1960s and 1990s. So we see that these wars were actually officially ended in the 90s, which is not that long ago. And it was important to also mention that it began before those SETI years and eventually continue after those years as well. And it's important also to mention the erasure that continues to happen, especially with indigenous communities in Central America. So we see that in Guatemala, indigenous rights were actually for the first time acknowledged in the Constitution in 2010. So that's not that long ago. We also see how El Salvador actually recognized indigenous peoples not that long ago in 2014. So there's still this kind of erasure and making indigenous peoples, especially in these countries, invisible as we talk today, even today. So one of the things that happened, especially with the Central American Civil War, that I like to mention is that it was kind of like the land back movement. And why was that? Is that during colonization, right, our lands were stolen, and then through land grabs, like hundreds or thousands of acres of land were actually sold to international corporations. And that's either cattle, also corporations that introduce monoculture farming, so the notions of plantations. And I think that these plantation, especially the plantation owners or the cattle ranch owners, were employing indigenous peoples. They were paying them actually nothing. They were just paying them with beans and tortillas, which is, a food source. They were not being actually compensated for their labor on top of, having to work the lands that were stolen from them. So as a result of that, right, the indigenous communities from Central America, including El Salvador and Guatemala, led the guerrilla movement, which was basically the first movements that we see to kind of reclaim that land, right? And I think that as a result of the United States and Canada backing the government, because they were afraid of communism, because they used the word communism, to get support from the United States and Canada, they were able to support the army and the government to use these violent tactics to kind of suppress the indigenous communities, especially as they were trying to reclaim the lands that were stolen from them, that now they had to work and not be compensated for their work. So a lot of the guerrilla movement actually, and the army was recruiting children. And my father was actually one of the child soldiers from his community that was recruited to fight in that war, or genocide as we speak today, when he was 11. So that's his childhood, as I mentioned in my book as well, and I would like to highlight in this presentation. So one of the things is that it was documented, right, that the Guatemalan and Salvadorian government actually used violent atrocities, especially as it targeted indigenous Maya communities. And I think that many of the military, especially from those countries, were trained by the United States. And I think that it's important to mention that because we're seeing how the United States likes to treat immigrants, especially from Central America. And I'm going to talk about what's forcing a lot of my people to migrate into the United States even today. So I think that, we have many elders like Rigoberta Menchú who have actually spoken about the Central American Civil War, but the indigenous perspective from that is still missing, right? So if you ever read a book on the Central American Civil War, or you read articles, it comes from a non-indigenous perspective. But I think that it's important to mention that, even though we're not defined by genocide, for many of us, it's a little bit hard to grapple with that, right? Because it's something that happened a generation or 2 generations ago, and many of us, including my father's who's here today, lived through that, right? So how do we grapple with not being defined by genocide when it's very present and it can only be traced like 10 or 20 years ago, as I speak, as I mentioned today. So I think that with what was happening in Central America, it's important to mention how there's this eco-colonialism movement, right, that happened, where non-indigenous peoples get to govern our natural resources and indigenous lands without consulting indigenous people. So as mentioned in Central America, they were actually farming and creating these cattle ranches on indigenous lands that were stolen from indigenous peoples, and we were not consulting, right, to how to preserve those lands. On the contrary, our cheap labor was actually requested so that those corporations will benefit and create more profits as they were doing the work that they were doing. Also, eco-colonialism, as I defined it, is the severe altering of our landscapes due to settler colonialism and the ideologies it introduced, right? So I think that talking about climate change, especially today, it's important to mention that climate change is a result of colonialism and how that's impacting even as we move forward. And we're seeing all these drastic natural disasters that are being amplified by climate change happen today, especially towards indigenous communities. And another layer of eco-colonialism is also the lack of resources offered to indigenous peoples or communities of color who are experiencing those impacts, right? So we're seeing how Puerto Rico is probably like the 3rd time they have experienced a hurricane, but yet the government is not taking action to support them. We're also seeing that in Alaska, how, Alaska, there's a lot of oil mining and drilling for petroleum, but yet the government is not taking action to support the communities as they experience those climate change impacts. So going back to climate change, and especially to the communities where I come from, we know that in Latin America, we possess 30% of the world's fresh water, yet because it's overexploited, it has also been privatized. Indigenous peoples don't have water rights. They don't have access to that water. So we have to kind of, experience water droughts or water scarcity, even though in our countries there's 30% of the world's freshwater reservoirs located there. So going back to the inequities, right, that we're experiencing as indigenous peoples, on top of the climate change impacts, we also see how many of our land defenders, especially indigenous leaders, are facing violence, right? And unfortunately, Latin America is considered the deadliest place for environmental leaders. So I always like to acknowledge the privilege that I have to be able to speak on these issues, especially as a displaced woman, because for what I speak or what I teach or research, a lot of my relatives back home are being persecuted for being loud, especially our indigenous women. So here we see a lot of indigenous women who have lost their lives, especially coming from Central America, who have advocated for the protection of our forests, for water rights, for our land rights. So we see how even climate change, especially when we talk about indigenous futures, it's led by indigenous women. I think that that's something important to mention because we see how patriarchy in a way, kind of erases Indigenous women's voices, especially from the climate change discourse, and doesn't necessarily give them the spotlight that they deserve at many times. So I think that, it's also important to mention that it has been Indigenous women who have led, recent resistance movements. So one of the movements that I actually my work kind of embodies is the Maya Quechí movement that it's happening even today, where they're actually fighting against Canadian nickel mine that's, owned by Canada, where, they're mining nickel and they're desecrating Indigenous lands. So the Maya Quechí community is actually fighting and leading a resistance movement. As of last week, they were violently kind of evacuated from their homes because, that's something that the army and the government led. So a lot of Maya Quechí leaders were evacuated from their homes forcefully, and that's something that you can see the videos on social media, and they're very triggering. So we see how even as Indigenous communities try to advocate for the protection of their lands, they're still being met with that violence and also that forceful evacuations from their own homes. So we see how Latin America, right, these things happen, and we see that throughout the Americas, right, even in the United States, it kind of parallels that, because going back to United States is one of the biggest supporters in suppressing Indigenous communities, especially of Latin America, in this case, Central America. So as a result, right, of experiencing so much violence, experiencing also water scarcity and climate change impacts, one of the things that we see is that we're seeing an increase in climate refugees, right? And as a result of, working for the International Maya League, we're seeing how there's a lot of Maya Indigenous peoples who are not necessarily making the decision, because that's actually the only choice they have, to leave their lands and come into the United States, because there's this false notion that they will find safety in the United States. But, obviously there's racism and other things that exist in the United States, but it's better conditions than the conditions that we have at home, right? So a lot of our people are being displaced because, they become climate refugees. So it's something that we're going to continue to see that, especially as the global north doesn't take action to mitigate climate change impacts, and it's going to force more of our people into the United States as we speak. So to give you a definition, because oftentimes in the legal sense, climate refugees have a specific definition, because most of the migrants that are receive, most of the attention are economic migrants, and that means that they're coming for better job opportunities or a living wage. But climate refugees are climate migrants that are a subset of environmental migrants who were forced to flee due to the sudden or gradual alterations in the natural environment. So if you're, for many of our Indigenous Maya communities, they qualify as climate refugees, but we're seeing how even a lot of the policies that were passed by the previous administration and are being maintained by this administration is pushing them back, even though they qualify as climate refugees. So they deserve the right to, seek asylum and be granted asylum, but we're seeing how the United States continues to use those policies in place to push back our relatives. And also we're seeing the separation of families, especially Indigenous children. And I'm going to talk about some of the cases within the US border. So as I mentioned, we are going to be seeing an increase in climate refugees, especially as we're seeing more natural impacts. So according to, the International Displacement Monitoring Center, 200 million to 1 billion total migrants will be due to climate change impacts by 2050. So imagine 200 million to 1 billion people are being displaced or will be displaced from their lands because of climate change impacts. So I think that it's important, right, to mention that and keep that in mind as well. We're also going to see a global displacement by weather-related events. So even the hurricanes and typhoons and all of these natural disasters are weather-related, right? Because that's how climate change is impacting our weather conditions. And in this case, their extreme weather events is going to continue to displace more people. And it's also internal displacement, right? So we see a lot of Indigenous peoples displaced from their restoration or traditional lands into cities or other places that are not sinking, right? So in the state of Washington, we're seeing how a lot of coastal Indigenous communities are being forced more inland because, we have sea level rise and their homes are being flooded. And I think that oftentimes, going back to the immigration narrative, there's so many different subsets that, you can be as an immigrant. So you can be here for political reasons, economic reasons, cultural reasons, environmental reasons, and social reasons. And I think that this is where the immigration policy fails Indigenous peoples, especially Indigenous peoples from outside of the United States, because as we can see, Indigenous peoples are forced to leave their lands, not for one of these reasons, right? But in the immigration policies, they like to kind of basically identify them as social immigrants, political immigrants, economic, cultural, political. But I think that as we are seeing, climate change is an intersectional issue, so it cannot be one of those things, right? So we're seeing how, as a result of that, we have a lot of climate refugees, and we struggle with the cases that are coming through the jurisdiction of the International Mayan League, because, it's very binary way of thinking, right? Where we had to put people in boxes, and I think that parallels to immigration policies as well. And as we know, many Indigenous peoples face disrupted social networks, labor exploitation. So we see that in the state of Washington, that kind of uses a lot of Indigenous migrants, especially from Oaxaca, to work as agricultural workers, right? So farm workers. And we see how that's exploited even further than, being a non-Indigenous farm worker, because oftentimes they don't speak Spanish. So, they usually have a translator. They have to go through these, middle person. So they're even paid less for their labor. So we see that a lot in the state of Washington. And we also see the lack of access to critical care or other resources. So oftentimes, working in that space, especially as climate change intersects with displacement, oftentimes people say, immigrants are going to take our jobs, but in reality, that's not the case, because they're not here for economic reasons. They're here because they don't have another choice. And as we have seen the news, especially the recent news, a lot of Indigenous peoples, because their journey is very harmful, right, and it's also dangerous, they have decided to come in caravans. And I think that we're seeing that a lot of them, through the Title 42 policy, a lot of them were sent back because, the previous administration was using COVID as an excuse to kind of refuse asylum seekers opportunity to seek asylum, even though they qualify for that. And we're seeing how, there's a dangerous road, right, because there is still xenophobia, anti-indigeneity that you experience as you're crossing the border through Mexico, through the United States. So a lot of them, especially with children, they decide to come in caravans as well. So I think that working in this intersection, right, it's important to mention that it's not an immigration issue, that's actually an intersectional issue, especially as it relates to climate change, because climate change is displacing many people as we speak today, especially Indigenous peoples from the global south. So how do we grapple with the idea that, once we come to the United States, we're labeled as immigrants, when in reality, these were our lands, in the sense that our relatives, our ancestors used to trade with one another, but then when these man-made borders were created, right, they separated us from the Indigenous solidarities that once existed through our ancestral times. Okay, let's see what's that. Did it freeze? Okay. Okay, so I think that, reading this statement from the International Mayan League, it reads, in the United States, a framework of extreme rhetoric, racism, discrimination, and fear against immigrants has made it even more important to advocate with our communities. We as Indigenous peoples are invisible because we're classified as Hispanics or Latinos and not recognized as being a part of an Indigenous nation. In turn, our communities are often forgotten, lost, and isolated within a complex and frightening immigration system. The experiences of exclusion is further exacerbated by language barriers, cultural differences, worldview, trauma from historical factors that have caused forced migration. So I think that it's important to mention that, right, that not every person that comes from Latin America is Indigenous, but the Indigenous peoples who are coming from Latin America, because the United States wants to avoid accountability and also the responsibility responsibility to enact the UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration of Indigenous Peoples. They misclassify many indigenous peoples from our nations as Hispanic or Latinx. And I think that, we know that that's an ethnicity that many embody, but for indigenous communities, that means that they are either denied access to Mayan, to, our native languages interpretation. So as a result of that, right, we're seeing how many of them offer services in Spanish. And unfortunately, that has resulted in the death of many of our indigenous Maya children, right? And I think that it's important to mention that because a lot of our children die from preventable or treatable causes like the flu, influenza, other issues that were not treated because the only medical services they were given were in Spanish. And many of these children who passed under U.S. Border Patrol custodies only spoke their Mayan languages. So we're seeing how, like I mentioned, climate change is an intersectional issue because in this case, it's also a native language rights issue, right? Where our people and our children are being denied access to their indigenous languages. So we have lost, hundreds of indigenous Maya children under the U.S. Border Patrol custody. So this is something that I have, talked about in my book that's also located in the museum for purchase, Fresh Banana Leaves. And instead of me reading the statement, I'm going to show a video that was produced with the International Mayan League, who I volunteer with as a climate justice policy strategist, so that we can bring more awareness to, indigenous peoples, especially the issues that we face when there's immigration at the table, right? So hopefully the sound works. I think it's just the internet.
You hear that immigrant children are dying at the border, you hear that Central Americans are dying at the border, but you don't hear that these are indigenous children dying at the border.
At the U.S. southern border, people from Guatemala make up the largest portion of...
Okay, I apologize, but I think that's the internet.
You hear that immigrant children are dying at the border, you hear that Central Americans are dying at the border, but you don't hear that these are indigenous children dying at the border.
At the U.S. southern border, people from Guatemala make up the largest portion of unaccompanied minors and family units apprehended. At least 6 known children have died in U.S. immigration custody. 5 of those children are indigenous Mayas from Guatemala. And if we include adults, 6 Guatemalan Mayas total have died at the U.S. border. The news reports them as Guatemalans, but their specific Maya nations get buried in the coverage. Mam, Quechí.
Sorry, what was that? Okay.
Chu, Chorti, Achi.
Okay, so I think it's the internet. So let me just pause it so that it can load. But I think, just to summarize the video, it talks about how many indigenous Maya children have died at the U.S. border, especially under U.S. Border Patrol, but yet their deaths are actually made invisible or erased, right? We have the privilege of working with the Piscataway Nation, especially in D.C., who has been the first supporter, Native American tribe who has come and supported us because, it's indigenous children who are dying at the border, but we're still seeing these political debates, right? Especially with miscarriage characterization of indigenous peoples as Hispanic or Latinx, the denial of indigenous language rights. So I think that when we talk about indigenous futures in the era of climate change, it's important to mention that climate change is leading to the severe displacement of many people, especially from the global south. We also saw how many of our Afro-Indigenous relatives from Haiti were treated by U.S. Border Patrol, and we saw that, they were actually whipped, back in the slavery times. And I think that's important to mention how there's this violence that's being enacted because, immigrants are seen as something that the United States tries to fight against, but many of these are not immigrants, they're displaced indigenous peoples. And I think that through this presentation, I also mentioned how there is that political and genocide history that we embody as indigenous Mayan people, coupled with climate change impacts, with, leading many of our people to take the ultimate, the only choice that they have, which is to leave our ancestral lands and come into the United States for a better life, right? And I think that it's important to mention that because in climate change discourses or science, climate refugees are rarely acknowledged or mentioned. I think that as a climate scientist, it's important for me to continue these discussions, especially when I present, right, to indigenous audiences.
We spoke to Maya immigrants in the US about the deaths of these young people at the border.
In como olveto tenam ishil.
At shitsahaw xol kunakil mam.
I'm from the Maya Mum Nation.
Some of them asked us to protect their identity for fear of persecution of their families in Guatemala.
Las muertes de estos niños en las fronteras, lo único que nos está haciendo es visibilizando.
In Guatemala, official statistics say the indigenous population is around 40%, but some think it could be as high as 60%. Despite being a large portion of the population, indigenous peoples in Guatemala face high levels of inequality, land disputes, and displacement.
Nosotros somos obligados a ir, a partir y a dejar lo que es nuestro, nuestra identidad, nuestro idioma. Somos una nación resistente aún.
In May 2018, 20-year-old Claudia Patricia Gomez was shot in the head by Border Patrol agents.
As I started hearing the news, I realized that she was from San Juan Ostuncalco, which is the village right next to where I was born, and that she was actually from my nation.
Then, reports of Maya children dying in U.S. custody started rolling in.
A little girl, Jacqueline, had died in custody. And then just 2 weeks later, we heard the news again, and Felipe died on Christmas Eve. Later, we had Juan. And then we heard that a toddler had died, 2.5 years old. His name was Wilmer. And not even 2 weeks later, another boy, a 16-year-old, his name was Carlos.
They died of things like bacterial infections, influenza, and pneumonia following ICE custody.
Son niños inocentes que vienen a ofrecer su vida como un sacrificio, demostrando y gritando el sufrimiento que pasa en nuestra comunidad.
One of the main challenges that indigenous migrants and refugees face at the border is the language barrier, both with English and Spanish. Aside from Spanish, there are 22 officially recognized indigenous languages in Guatemala.
Muchas veces no hablamos el idioma español y nos encontramos con esa barrera al entrar a este país. Desconocemos lo que es el idioma inglés.
We've asked for interpreters in their languages because you cannot have access to justice if you can't express yourself. And if they can't express themselves in their language, then they can't tell the complete story of what happened.
Mam, Quiche, and Canjobal, Maya languages indigenous to Guatemala, are in the top 25 most common languages spoken in U.S. immigration court today. Despite this, there's often a shortage of interpreters of indigenous languages, and the language barrier can be deadly. Detained immigrants who speak an indigenous language are less likely to receive medical care. 7-year-old Jacqueline Cal's father, Neri Gilberto Calcus, signed a form stating that she was in good health. The form was in English. Cal's first language was Maya Quechua. Jacqueline Cal died of a bacterial infection. Indigenous Guatemalans also face high malnutrition rates. Malnutrition in Guatemala is 47%, with up to 70% in some indigenous areas. The Alta Verapaz province, where Jacqueline Cal was from, has a 59% chronic malnutrition rate among children.
Todas las tierras de mis ancestros han sido expropiadas por los grandes empresarios terratenientes que han ocupado las sagradas tierras.
Palm oil plantations have been encroaching on indigenous land in rural Guatemala.
So you look at the case, for instance, of Jacqueline Cal. The area that she came from is today heavily controlled by transnational corporations, by palm oil plantations.
In 2018, 18 land defenders were murdered in Guatemala.
Muchos de nuestros hermanos están también siendo perseguidos dentro del territorio por las grandes empresas extractivas que están llegando como una forma de monopolizar todos los recursos existentes.
People from Guatemala started coming to the U.S. in big numbers fleeing war.
En 1980 explotó más la guerra en mi país.
There was a mass exodus because of genocide that was occurring in our lands and territories.
Guatemala experienced a 36-year civil war between 1960 and 1996.
No es porque nosotros quisimos venir a este país, sino que estamos buscando vida porque somos refugiados, no somos inmigrantes, porque nunca pensé salir de mi madre tierra.
The United States under the Reagan administration poured hundreds of millions of dollars into the Guatemalan military. The Guatemalan military was responsible for 93% of human rights abuses during the war.
More than 200,000 of our people were killed or disappeared, and over 1.5 million were forcibly displaced. Most of them, most of us, were Maya people.
In present-day Guatemala, indigenous people are leading the charge to prosecute war criminals from that era. Efraín Ríos Montt, dictator of Guatemala from 1982 to 1983, was convicted of genocide and crimes against humanity in 2013. Ríos Montt was charged for the massacre of 1,771 Maya Ixil people. However, his conviction was later overturned and he died at age 91. The oppression of Maya peoples in Guatemala didn't start with the Civil War.
El genocidio empezó desde la llegada de los españoles.
Tenemos 500 años de resistir en nuestro territorio por todas las injusticias. Los pueblos mayas somos pueblos que hemos existido y que hemos resistido ante diferentes tipos de invasiones.
Es una larga noche que hemos tenido, es un largo caminar que tenemos de ser exiliados en nuestra propia tierra, de ser obligados a no hablar nuestro idioma, de ser obligados a no usar nuestro traje que nos identifica.
There's at least 1.3 million people of Guatemalan origin in the United States. However, it's unclear how many of those people are indigenous.
We're inaccurately mislabeled as Latino or Hispanic or Latinx, but it's also caused a process of erasing our existence, erasing our identity.
Though made invisible, Mayas are part of the fabric of U.S. immigrant communities.
Es un reto empezar de nuevo. Y los mayas sí existimos aquí.
What's happening to Mayas at the U.S. southern border is backed by centuries of oppression.
The root drivers of forced migration for many of us has been because of our indigenous identity, because of the large-scale persecution we have lived.
The International Mayan League has made demands of the U.S. government. Those include thorough and transparent investigations into the deaths on the border and a dialogue with indigenous leaders on developing humane immigration policies.
Los gobiernos no son nuestros gobiernos, son gobiernos de los ricos, de grandes empresarios, terratenientes, pero no hemos tenido nosotros una representación dentro de los gobiernos, sea aquí en Estados Unidos, sea en otro país. No hemos tenido un reconocimiento.
Hey.
So I think that video does a great job of like also showing the visuals of like how indigenous Maya people are actually impacted by climate change. And then we see that intersection with migration. And one of the things that, you know, it's important for me, especially as a climate scientist, is like I walk in three worlds, right? Because I have to respect our indigenous solidarities, our relatives from, you know, the United States, but I also have to continue the work that I do back home. And, you know, this year I was recognized as one of the 100 most powerful women of Central America by Forbes. But I think that it goes beyond that, right? Because that shows the responsibility that I carry as an indigenous woman, because, you know, there were not many of us in that list to continue the legacies that, you know, our parents, our grandparents actually have basically created for us, especially as displaced people, and seeing how we can build those indigenous solidarities. And for anybody who's more interested in that work, tomorrow I have the privilege to be in conversation with Dr. Daniel Wildcat and talking about indigenous solidarities and how can we talk about climate change, climate justice, and, you know, going beyond those man-made borders as we are seeing how climate change is impacting indigenous communities. So thank you for my presentation, and I think it's questions and answer time. But thank you, everyone. Paducci.